So thank y'all for being here. So next acknowledgement, what we like to do is I want to welcome Monica Villarreal from the Gualegua tribe and Joyce Day from the Lakota Nation. They are going to do a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to go ahead and sit and thank y'all so much for being here.
Hello. Grand Rising, good morning, Kualitanesi. As they mentioned, my name is Monica Villarreal. This is Joyce Day. I am from the Gualegua tribe. I am adopted as well by the Mexica people, Chichimeca. And my family from my paternal side has always lived in these lands. So very much a native from these lands. And we're here to do the land acknowledgement. And to begin the land acknowledgement, we're going to open the 4 directions with mentioning it in Nahuatl. And by speaking our native languages, we're not only welcoming our ancestors, but we're welcoming all of your guys' ancestors as well. And we're gonna close with a 4 directions song. So just so that you know. And you guys are welcome to join us. We're going to be facing the directions. If y'all want to do that with us, you're welcome to do that or stay seated. Tasukamati. Tasukamati. Kesalcoat. Tasukamati. Tasukamati Xipetotec. Tlasokamati Tezcalipoca. Tlasokamati Huitzilopochtli. Tlasokamati Tonatiu. Tlasokamati Tonantsinclali. So those are the 7 directions actually, because we also greet our Father, Sun, and our Mother, Earth. So in order for us to talk about the land acknowledgement, we have to acknowledge that we are in stolen land. These lands were inhabited by people before colonization, by people as Corancoa people, Lipan Apache, the Carrizo Come Crudo, the Coahuiltecan people, the Mexica people, people who spoke Nahuatl, and many other tribes and many other native people. And by mentioning that, we also want to talk about our responsibility, the people that are here, not just the native people as me and Joyce, but just all the people that are here to uplift native voices and to have these opportunities for us to speak, because we are still very much alive. And although a lot of our traditions and cultures and languages have been stolen or taken away from us, we are still in the practice of wanting to revive that and to survive that. And so I just want to thank TASA for inviting us out here and to talk about these things, as well as for their work that they do for a lot of Native women and children who are actually missing because of sexual violence, because of sexual assault, because of abuses that are being put on Native nations, Native lands, and Native territories. Just to say a few, that was just saying a few things. I'll allow Joyce to introduce herself and she's going to share as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joyce Day, and I have relatives and ancestors that stretch from all over Turtle Island, from north of in the Dakotas to as far south as Mexico. My ancestors from Mexico came from the area which is now known as Chihuahua, and came to this area of Texas now, and they have been here in this area for years and years. With some tribes, to some nations, they were displaced from their lands and have lost a lot of their cultural heritage, their dances, their language, their ceremonial practices, which is the case for many of the nations here in Texas. I'm fortunate that one of my sides of indigeny is from South Dakota, and we have been on those lands forever, and we weren't moved out of those lands. So we've had the opportunity to keep our language and to keep our culture and to keep our ceremonies and to keep our songs, and acknowledging that the land is our mother. The land is our mother, and we can't do anything without the mother. And it's up to the Native people. It's up to us to take care of the land and be stewards of the land. I want to explain a little bit or tell you about the song that we sang, that we opened with, and it's a good morning song. And it says, good morning, friends, on this day we send our voice. And that's what we're doing here. We're doing here with this conference, with these organizations, we're sending our voice. And for some people, it's become almost a fad to be Native or to be dealing with Native issues. And it's a double-edged sword, because there is a lot of things being brought to the forefront right now. There's a television show on Prime Video that tells all about this young woman, and she finds herself, she sees some danzas aztecas at a wedding, and she connects with the songs, she connects with the dances. And that's what we do as Indigenous people. We connect with the songs that connects us to the earth, that connects us to our ancestors. And that's how we steward the land as well as we can. And all the songs we sing are prayers and blessings. And these songs have been passed down through oral tradition for years and years. And we'd like to sing another couple of songs. And one of the things that we believe in right now is we're living in a time of prophecy, this time of the eagle and the condor, where the North and the South are going to come together. And it's going to take a lot of Native people to get together and be together and stand as one heart and one voice to get the messages across and get them out and to have these conversations. So we're going to sing another little song about our ancestors.
That that was dedicated to all of our mothers as well as our Mother Earth and our grandmothers. We're gonna sing a few more songs, about two more, and then turn it over back to the conference. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Is anyone here familiar with the Idle No More movement with the Native community? Basically, we're saying we will be idle no more, and there's songs and just all kind of movements going on right now. And this is the main song about that movement, but also it holds true for lots of things. For the work that we're doing here, we need to stand up and send our voices and say, we will be idle no more about this. We will be idle no more.
Mateo. Oh, Mateo. Like I mentioned earlier, we're actually gonna finish with the Four Directions song, but that song that we just sang right now is pretty much where a lot of Native people are. We're idle no more. We're in a place of now wanting to keep our traditions or our cultures in secret. We're being loud about what we want for our families and ourselves, and we we're in a time of a new sun, and this was part of Cuauhtémoc's mandato, which Cuauhtémoc Sin was the last leader of the Aztec people, and he taught us in his last mandate that at a certain era we were going to be in secret, we're going to be in hiding, and there'll be a time where there'll be a new sun. We're able to do these things in open and sing our songs and learn our culture and learn our languages. So thank you for having us, for allowing us to be here, and for sharing our traditions and our songs.
So as Monica said, this is a Four Direction song in Lakota, in the Lakota language, and it says, look towards the east and beseech and pray and ask, whatever your term is. Look towards the north and ask, look towards the east, and it just goes all around. The four directions are very important for us. The four cardinal directions, the four winds. 4 is a very important number for the Native people.
Thank you. Pastor Kamati.
Thank you both very much. That was beautiful. It was very nice to be a part of such an honored tradition, and thank you for the acknowledgement. Thank you for being here. Okay, I'm going to try to sit down without being graceful. Okay, or with being graceful. So again, I'm sorry. I don't know how to sit in these chairs. So now we're gonna move over to our coffee chat. We had last year we tried coffee chat virtually. That became a very popular thing. So being that TASA is celebrating 40 years of existence, we thought, well, really it was at the insistence of Richard, and he'll introduce himself here in a second. But he brought to us a really great idea for us just to sit back and listen to some, the past 40 years of how things got started. So I'm from rural Texas, as I said earlier, and I really, one of the things I love to do is to sit around a campfire and listen to grandma and grandpa, not that y'all are grandma and grandpa, that doesn't come out right, to the elders, or listen to your aunts and uncles, the cool uncles, talk about, kind of how things were when they were growing up. You've heard the stories about 100 feet of snow and, walking 100 miles and 100 feet of snow, whatever. Or those are the stories I heard growing up, but I thought they were fun. So it's kind of like that, but we're going to talk a little bit about the history of TASA. So first thing is, so I'd like for you, Richard, to start. I know that we like to orient everyone about the beginning of TASA and how this concept even came to be and what you all did to get it there. And I'll let you start. And if anybody else wants to add in, that would be great. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Annette. Annette's my boss. I still call her my boss. I would like for everybody to, to introduce themselves. I'm jumping right ahead. So if y'all will take a minute to introduce yourselves, and then we'll start with the question.
Thank you, Rose. First of all, thank you for your cooperation along with your staff for making this happen. It's been a really good experience. Normally wouldn't speak for a bunch of women, but I think I can speak for them in that one point. Right? Okay, my name is Richard Orton. I was hired in 1978 as the public education director of the Austin Rape Crisis Center. A few years later, I was involved along with Ann and Sherry in what became the first meeting of TASA in Galveston, 1982. And I ended up serving on the board for a number of years as the chair of the Public Education Task Force.
I am Sherry Gutierrez, and I started out at the Austin Rape Crisis Center in October of 1977 as a client. And a few months later, Sylvia Calloway, who is the director of the center, asked me if I would go and talk to a group of psychology students. And she introduced us, there were several of us there, she introduced us as volunteers. And I thought to myself, oh, now I'm a volunteer for the Austin Rape Crisis Center. So that's how I started. I served as a volunteer for crisis services and as volunteer speaker. I helped to train the speakers. I talked about my rape experience to the classes who were coming through the volunteer trainings. And I also talked about it to different professional groups, nurses, doctors, judges. So I was really honored to do that. And it was a really important part of my personal healing. I was also the first program administrator for the Texas Department of Health, Sexual Assault and Crisis Services. This is the first money that was made available to the state of Texas as part of the block grant program. And maybe we can talk about that more later on. But basically they put the money, it was required to be spent on sexual assault crisis services. And so it went into the Texas Department of Health Emergency Medical Services section. They didn't know where else to put it. So I was at the Galveston meeting in my position as working for the state. And I also served as TASA president from 1990 to 1992. In February of 92, as TASA president, I was asked to testify on behalf of the first bill that became the Violence Against Women Act. And I also spoke at the press conference that Tanya organized in response to the remark that Clayton Williams, who was a candidate for governor, made to a collection of reporters that bad weather is like rape, he said. If it's inevitable, just relax and enjoy it. TASA's response was pretty immediate and had wide coverage throughout the state. That was in March of 1990. His opponent, Ann Richards, won. So after 20 years of working, the last 20 years I worked at the University of Texas at San Antonio, the Center for Archaeological Research, and now I'm happily retired and still a very active in a number of different causes.
I'm Annette Burroughs Clay. I started doing this work at Mujeres Unidas in their first volunteer class back in I couldn't remember if it was late 77 or early 78, but it was a long time ago. Also worked at the Alpine Women's Center, which is now the Crisis Center of the Big Bend. Quite a few years in California doing the work, and then spent 20 years with TASA. So I'm definitely one of the grandmas here. So here. Oh.
Ann Robinson. I was on the founding TASA board with Richard and Sherry. I followed Sherry at the Texas Department of Health as the program manager. And for the last 34 years, I've been the director of the Montrose Center, which is a center here in Houston that serves primarily the LGBTQ community. I started my rape crisis work in 1974 in Pittsburgh when I was in college. And so that makes it, I guess, a 48-year commitment. So.
Good morning. My name is Lacey Sloane. I was not in the first decade of TASA. Yeah, that's right. You can see how young we look. And I actually started at the Family Crisis Center in Harlingen, Texas, when I was invited by Lynn Thompson Haas to join a movement. And that's what I did. I served as TASA president, as TASA child sexual abuse chair, taking over from Richard Orton from 86 to 89. I then served a year as secretary. I then served as the National Coalition Against Sexual Assault regional representative for 3 years. And then I followed Sherry as president of TASA from 92 to 94. And then I just couldn't get enough. I came back and did presidency again from 98 to 2000. Right? Yep.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tanya Edmond. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I started this work kind of like what you were saying, Rose. I grew up in a very small rural community in Kansas, went to Kansas State for my undergraduate, and that's where I got involved in the movement to end violence against women. And so I started working in this field in 1980. And was part of working at the Regional Crisis Center in Manhattan, Kansas. And when I moved to Texas, so moved to Austin to go to graduate school, I started volunteering at the Austin Rape Crisis Center in 1984. And Richard and Sylvia, who he referenced, were my volunteer training facilitators, which was just a terrific experience. And I ended up staying as a volunteer at the Austin Rape Crisis Center, as well as the Center for Battered Women for 5 years, and eventually became the executive director of the Hayes County Women's Center in San Marcos, which is where I met Lacey. She was on the search committee to hire me. And then we both went over to the Austin Rape Crisis Center, where I was the director of client services. I joined TASA. I served on the TASA board for 5 years, originally as the survivor caucus chair, then the vice president of membership, and then the vice president of administration, I think. So I served as her vice president under 2 of her terms, and was also the executive director of the Albuquerque Rape Crisis Center for a while before deciding going into academia. And currently I'm the interim co-dean of the George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, and have spent the last 23 years working primarily in Texas in collaboration with TASA and rape crisis centers across the state, doing research in service of finding ways to improve the quality of care that we provide to survivors.
All right, thank y'all so much. So now we're going to get into how to orient all of us. Richard, if you could explain how TASA came to be, and I heard Galveston's involved and a lot of other things. So if you could kind of get us situated, and then if you all want to chime in, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Thank you, Rose. In 1970, there was no such thing as a rape crisis center anywhere. But early in that decade, women began to speak out about their experiences with sexual violence. Beginning in New York City, speak outs were organized for women who had been raped to tell their stories. Nothing like this had ever happened before. It was an outgrowth of feminist consciousness raising groups that encouraged an openness to acknowledging the rape experience and support for rape victims. This led to the creation of anti-rape squads around the country, doing public speaking, teaching self-defense, and creating a greater awareness of the problem. Some of these groups were more radical than others in confronting alleged rapists. In 1972, some of these groups began to morph into self-help groups that came to be known as rape crisis centers. On their own and with no funding for the most part, these women created all volunteer support services for rape victims and educational programs to promote social change. The women who created rape crisis centers were working against cultural and patriarchal attitudes that were thousands of years old. But they were determined to succeed, not necessarily in their own lifetimes, but to pass the torch to succeeding generations to continue the work. This is how we have come to be here now. The Austin Rape Crisis Center opened in July of 1974 after the local National Organization for Women chapter had established a rape task force a year earlier. Many other centers came into being in Texas throughout the 70s. In 1982, Mary Jane Worst, director of the Galveston Rape Crisis Center, hosted the organizational meeting of what became the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault in Galveston. I remember a dozen or more of us sitting on the floor of a beach house on stilts the evening before the meeting, sharing our hopes for the future and our common purpose. The next day, Sunday, April 4th, 1982, we had a state coalition meeting at the University of Texas Medical Branch. The agenda included a discussion led by Sylvia Calloway, director of the Austin Rape Crisis Center, on the historical and present status of TASA and the newly formed National Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Sylvia was then the vice president of NCASA. She later became the president. We spent the rest of the day discussing organizational and policy issues and hearing a report from Sherry Good of the Texas Department of Health Sexual Assault Prevention and Crisis Services Program on the status of current and future grant monies available to Texas rape crisis centers. What began as women sharing their experiences about being raped in the early 70s led to the creation of rape crisis centers throughout the country and in Texas to the creation of the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault in 1982. My hope this morning is that our panel can convey to you a sense of where we all came from in the work we are doing now and to strengthen your efforts taking it forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. So next, I'm sure y'all faced some challenges in the early days. How about you, Lacey? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the early work to change the laws to combat some of these early challenges?
Okay, yes, by the 80s, things were rolling pretty wild with the legislature. We were working on issues such as actually just making it, for example, illegal for a spouse to rape their spouse. We worked several sessions on that and ended up going bit by bit to get the marital rape exemption removed. We also worked very hard to get things like closed circuit TV for child sexual abuse survivors to testify. We worked many years trying to get the polygraph exam eliminated in Texas, and that really didn't happen until many years later when I think it was DBAWA 2004, the Department of Justice put into the regulations that any state that receives VAWA money, which is every state, could not ever ask, request, require a survivor who went to report sexual assault that a polygraph exam. It was banned. But I think there might be some earlier work that maybe maybe Ann and Sherry and then we'll talk about before we get into maybe some of the other legislation, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, the challenges in the beginning is there was no money. And I think we were existing on United Way, bingo money. There were a lot of organizations that were doing bingo at that time, and they had to donate a certain amount to nonprofits. bake sales, car washes, you name it. But we really existed and grew because of volunteers. I know it's very difficult to get volunteers to make the commitment nowadays. Back then, if we hadn't had that, we wouldn't have existed. Volunteers did most of our accompaniment. They did a lot of our speaking. They did, the hotline, yes. We were talking last night up until the wee hours, and I just stopped answering the hotline about a year ago as the director of our agency. But it would not have been possible without armies of volunteers.
Tanya, did you want to add anything to some of the early legislation or?
Well, I
early
think
work?
one of the things that was a piece that we worked on was to make it a crime for a therapist to have sex with a client. So, and again, this is one of the things where we have a question coming up about research, but it's a really neat through line because Lacey and I both are academics, but we are academics because of our passion for this work that was started through this movement that she's referencing. And so one of the things that happened when we were at the Austin Rape Crisis Center was we had clients coming forward who had been sexually abused by their therapist, but it wasn't a crime. And they could lose their license, but continue to practice as long as they didn't call themselves a psychologist or a social worker. And so there wasn't any recourse. There was just trauma because it was seen as consensual sex rather than recognizing the abuse of power and the exploitation in that. And we worked for 2 legislative sessions to make it a felony for a therapist to do this. But part of the drive in that was not just what we were hearing from our clients. Lacey and I called every rape crisis center across Texas and asked them if they were seeing any kind of experience like this. And then used that information and with survivor volunteers, presented the information to the state legislature to say, this is a gap that we have in terms of really holding perpetrators accountable because there were real predators in this space. And so that was I think one of our legislative successes that was really meaningful for us. And Texas became, I think, the second state in the country to make that a crime. And so that was one that I felt really proud of.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that. The next thing, it sounds like you all recognize the disparities even early on. It seemed when I talked to you last night, you all recognized too about the importance of prevention, not only the intervention and working with survivors of sexual assault, but also what can we do to minimize these incidences from occurring. So I wanted to start with Sherry, and then Anna, I have a question for you, but Sherry, can you tell us a little bit about the mindset and what you all were thinking and how you all even approached the issue of prevention? And this is all before funding.
At the Galveston gathering, we talked a lot about, of course, what we thought TASA needed to do. We talked about a lot of ways that we could share information, share resources, and that was a very important part of it. And another important part of it was just us being together from all over the state and to see what we were doing. But all of that was helpful. One of the things that we talked about early on was we needed to, we were providing services as best we could with very little funding, and like she said, with a lot of volunteers. So we were providing those services. Some centers had already started doing some public speaking in different kinds of groups. And it evolved that we had really 2 things that we needed to do public education about. One was avoidance, which is how a particular person can escape or avoid being sexually assaulted. And the other that we were concerned about was prevention. Basically, it came down to how do we change our culture? What can we do to help keep little boys from growing up to be rapists? I mean, that was the question that we were asking. It's a question we're still asking now. But we looked at a lot of different, there was not a lot of research. There was not a lot of places that we could go for this information. But what what evolved over the years is that, you know, it's very much a repeat cycle. So we thought like going into schools and talking to children would be high on the agenda, because if we could prevent them or identify kids who were being abused, that was going to be really, really important, not just for those individual kids, but for our culture in general.
Thank you. Thank you. And next, again, I mentioned that last night you all talked about just acknowledging and recognizing the disparities. And I know, Anne, you brought up some good points about, you know, even serving men and what that was like in the early days. And now, I don't know if you wanted to speak on that.
And not just the early days, it's still a problem now. So, you know, I run a center that works a lot with gay men and trans people, and they don't feel welcome anywhere, especially when all of the programs have women in their title. So it was very difficult to have male volunteers. A lot of the women didn't want to have men anywhere around them. Poor Richard was one of the brave ones that stuck it out early on, and it's very heartening to see more men at the conference. But there were, not just for sexual assault, but also for domestic violence, there were no services. There were not places that welcomed them. If they did get services, they didn't get equal services, because they got, there weren't enough at one time for a group. And it was just, at the conferences, the women would not even want to see Richard walking down the hall at the conference because they felt threatened by that. So there was a lot of internal healing that the movement needed to do to accept and welcome and encourage men to be part of the healing process.
Awesome. And I, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, Annette, but I think, you know, I feel like Texas leads the way in a lot of things. And I think one of the many ways that we as our great state has led this, the anti-sexual violence movement is that, Annette, I believe you were one of the first to hire a male in the coalition. Is that right? Across the state? Is that correct? I mean, across the country, sorry.
Richard was at TASA even. Oh, so Richard was briefly at TASA shortly before I was there, but yes, I think still, even without Richard, TASA, I believe, was the first statewide coalition that had male staff, and it was quite an oddity for some years. And then when it was more than one male and more than 5 males and more than 7 males, I think it's still, I don't believe there's any state that has the number of men working at the coalition level that TASA has.
And could I simply add very briefly, this is because of a woman named Sylvia Calloway, who we've already mentioned. She was the director of the Rape Crisis Center in Austin, and she had the crazy, or at least unusual, idea that because men were the problem, perhaps they could be part of the solution. And that's what led her to look for a guy to hire, which ended up being me.
So I just want to add, and one of the things we want to make sure we do is not just make this about the Austin Rape Crisis Center, but it was an amazing organization within the state that had a profound leadership role, I think, across the state. But the Austin Rape Crisis Center, when I was a director of client services, we started the first survivor support group for men that I think existed in the state. And we had a volunteer force of over 200 people, and nearly half of them were men. So there was a philosophy that Sylvia imbued in our organization that we modeled throughout all aspects. So for as long as I had any connection to ARCC, which was a long time, that we had men on our staff, on our board, and as a strong part of our volunteer base. And we think that was really critical in supporting, really trying to do some of the cultural change and the systems level work that was a major part of our efforts at that time. So.
Tanya, hold that mic because I have a question for you. Last night you mentioned about the early history in Texas, TASA's role, our sexual advocacy role in SANE nurses. Can you repeat that story to the?
Yeah, I mean, this was again, just where one of the things that has been so critically important about the existence of TASA is our ability to innovate and share what we're learning with each other across the work, because we've had, has been expressed, so little funding historically that people have done a lot with very little, and it has required innovation and creativity to make that possible. And so one of the things, as an example of that, was coming to being on the TASA board and learning about SANE sexual assault nurse examiners beginning to operate in Houston through the Houston Area Women's Center. And so we were able to learn from that and do a training. We brought the folks to talk about what SANE nurses could do in each community to begin to replicate what was happening in Houston, which we did in Austin. So again, which was a huge challenge with the number of medical systems that were embedded. And again, it was in recognition that this was a system that was exacerbating trauma. It was making the trauma worse for survivors because they would come to an ER and wait for 12 or 16 hours to be seen by someone. I literally had experiences where I was explaining to the doctor how to conduct a rape exam. The trauma of this process was really profound and a norm in those early days. So the idea of having SANE nurses who were then working in partnership with our sexual assault advocates to support survivors through that immediate medical trauma, but then recognizing that we as advocates could support them through the rest of the process. It was through TASA and learning about the existence of SANEs that we were able to bring that to the Austin community. So this is such a great venue for how we learn and grow together.
Thank you. And Sherry, you mentioned something last night about how you had to, in the early days, to get more SANEs on board or medical professionals on board, how you would almost share a video so that they could learn how to do these things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, we had at one point when I was working for the Texas Department of Health, I had a number of calls from law enforcement officers saying that they didn't have any hospitals in maybe a 3 or 4 county area that could do rape exams. No one knew how to do them. And suddenly they're having all these reports and, it was increasing with a lot of the changes that we were trying to make. And we did a lot of publicity and a lot of, public education. More people were coming forward and then they had no place to take them to do a rape exam, or they would have to travel for, 2 hours to get to some hospital. And so we didn't have any staff to do that. So I acquired a film that was made in New York. It was a film about how to do a rape exam. It had exactly what you were supposed to do, preservation of evidence, all of that. And it actually had how to do an exam on a living person and also a deceased person. It was a very interesting film. I'm not a healthcare professional at all, but I would take this film because it was better than nothing. It was better than not having any information at all. And I could share my experiences from the perspective of here's what not to say and here's what to say, to a rape victim. So I did that in a number of different places. And it's just, to me, it's an example of, we started with nothing. I mean, it's really important for me to communicate to you that if we didn't have a training manual, we didn't have any ways to teach people how to be public speakers. We didn't have any of that. And when we needed it, someone created it. Either, you know, any of us could have done it. And we shared all of the things that we were developing. But it's just important to remember that we started with no funding and very few other kinds of resources. And like you said, it was all volunteer. It was people coming forward and saying, this is a terrible problem and we need to try to do something to change it. And I sometimes look back on it and think, what made us think we could do that? You know, personally, I would say, I'd get a call saying, can you come talk to kindergarten class? And I'm like, sure, we can do that. Hang up the phone and go, what did I just say? I don't know anything about talking to a kindergarten class, but it was those kinds of things. We did it because we knew it was important that somebody do it and there was nobody else. So we just stepped up.
Thank you.
And-
And I know what some, oh, go
One other
ahead.
thing about the exams, I don't think people realize that in the beginning, besides nobody knew what they were doing, at the time that literally, at the time that the survivor went to the hospital, the police department would be the ones that paid for the exam. It wasn't crime victims compensation yet, the police department. So the officer there had to make a decision right then, whether or not they thought this was a good case and whether or not it was going to go, so they could decide whether or not the police department was going to pay for the exam. So, so as you know, lots of survivors go to the hospital and they're not sure they want the exam. They're not sure they want to press charges. And so it was our job to convince the survivor to at least collect the evidence just in case and convince the officer that, yes, this is a good case. You need to pay for the exam so that she didn't end up with a big bill from the emergency room.
And I know what a lot of you are thinking. You're like, hey, we still have, places where there are no SANE exams. There are rural areas in Texas. But I will say that we've come a long way. Still have a long way to go, but we've come a long way. So we have two examples of that. Is we have Texas FNE. They're out of Houston. Kara Breeden and her group, they travel to rural areas around Houston and provide exams. I know one time there was one of the colleges in a small town was saying how their students were having to travel, I don't know how many hours to get to a SANE exam. And by that time, they're like, forget it, I don't want to do this. So what Kara and her group did is they created an MOU with that small college, and now they provide SANE exams there. So that's one example. The other thing is Texas A&M, through their partnership with the Office of the Attorney General, they have something called Text Track, and that is going to rural areas. And I know they're working with TASA and in partnership with TASA because they understand how important it is to have an advocate in the room, especially when there's like this remote thing. And so we're making strides to have SANE exams. We're still not where we need to be, but thank y'all for sharing that. Yes. Texas innovation, absolutely. Because I think we're one of the first. There might be another state. I don't know if anybody from A&M is here, but I think we are one of the first. So I'm really, really proud of that partnership between Office of the Attorney General, Texas A&M, and TASA. So we're very excited about that. Okay, so next, everyone's favorite topic, which is funding. So Anne, you said that in the early days, if it wasn't for volunteers, this work may not have gotten done to that level. So I don't know if you wanted to add more to that. And then I wanted to hand it to Lacey to talk about VAWA and where we are now.
Yeah, so we did have Victims of Crime Act money early on, but again, it was a very small amount and we had to compete with police departments and shelters and district attorney's offices that wanted special positions in their departments for that. So other than that, when the block grant came that Sherry talked about, it was all churches and bingo parlors and bake sales and volunteers.
Yes, and one thing that I want to add with this funding is that while TASA incorporated in 1982, I believe it was, we did not apply intentionally for our 501c3 until we knew VAWA was coming down the pike in the 90s. And part of that was because we had no money and there were limits if you're a 501c3 on how much legislative advocacy you could do. So we didn't want to have our hands tied. We also didn't want to take money away from rape crisis centers. So we decided, and maybe now we might think that was or wasn't a good decision, that we were going to help get money for the rape crisis centers. And once there was enough money, then TASA would be willing to go for our 501c3, which we did when VA was coming down the pike in 94. I was the president from 92 to 94, and VAWA changed everything, obviously. Obviously, that was part of a bigger bill that also created a lot of problems, the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, because it was part of the omnibus crime bill back then. But it definitely made a difference for survivors of sexual violence and for many different communities. And that is when we finally decided to get our 501c3 and open a TASA office. And at that point, I guess 94 must be when Amy Mock came in as president. I was the $1 a year staff person for TASA at that point. And I helped her. We worked on trying to get money from, I think it was the city of McKinsey, who was then in y'all's role, to get money for the state office. And we got an office downtown, and we were, working on hiring people, but it really did, it changed, everything as far as having resources. Not that it's enough, of course, but it really did change everything. I think that's the main point.
All right, wonderful. So Annette, I think one of your many amazing legacies, and there will be many, is your decision to go after, it's Fund 5010. It's now called Fund 5010. It's out of the Office of the Attorney General is who disperses the money. But it was the adult entertainment fee, or the we call it the SOB Act, Sexually Oriented Business, but Fund 5010 for short. So Annette, can you tell us a little bit about the idea, where it came from, and what that did to really change and alter the funding landscape for sexual assault programs?
So I think the idea came from a couple of places. I think one, to be totally honest, we kind of ripped the idea off from Governor Rick Perry. At the time, he was running for governor, and the person who was running against, Carol Keaton Straight, she has about 1 million names. I'm sorry, I can't remember them all. But anyway, she was running against him, and he had this idea where the funds coming out of these strip clubs would help fund these programs that were actually in school. And it didn't fly well, because they started putting commercials up where it showed, people getting off on school buses at strip clubs and this kind of thing. And so we started talking about a sustainable fund, and we were like, a lot of our programs are working with dancers at strip clubs who are being sexually assaulted, because frequently, the other type of criminal elements that sometimes will also present themselves around these areas. And we started looking for research and that type of thing, and finding correlations, and thought that this was a great idea to find some sustainable funding for rape crisis centers who have been doing this work for a long time. And for those of you who've been around a while, this was not an easy sell. We got it through the legislature. The Attorney General's office had to go to lots of court cases after it passed. We lost in court. We just kept going further and further. The solicitor with the AG's office, Jim Ho, was fabulous. He did a wonderful job in court. And I mean, this went all the way up through the state Supreme Court, and then the US Supreme Court decided to let the state case. Anyway, lots of legal challenges, but it finally came through. And it brings in a lot of funding into the state. An alarming amount of money into the state in some ways. And then, the part of the argument then was, well, what are you going to do now? Is it in your best interest for these clubs to remain open? And you know, are you actually now promoting these businesses because you have money? And it's like, well, you know, tobacco money has been used to fund hospitals and things. You know, if strip clubs go away, we'll live with it. We've been without money before. So the important thing is we should start expecting folks to be contributing to sexual assault around these communities. And I think some of us on this panel would, you know, actually like to see, you know, alcohol tax money being used, because there's certainly a probably even stronger connection to that. But for those of you who are panicking about that, no, I'm not in charge of TASA anymore, and I'm not saying that that can happen. But I just think that you have to be creative. And not just creative, but you need to stick with it, and you need to understand that these programs deserve to be funded. And frankly, it used to piss me off that we were fighting for money when TDCJ wasn't having a bake sale. You know, the police departments weren't having garage sale. And certainly providing that advocacy and support for survivors is every bit as important as these other folks who are in the system. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we make TDCJ have a garage sale. But what I'm saying is we shouldn't be begging for money that needs to be there for survivors from the very beginning.
Yes.
Rose,
thank
can I add something? So, you know, some of you in the room know this, but some of you may not. I mean, the whole reason rape crisis centers came into existence is because the existing systems that were in place, medical systems, criminal justice systems, law enforcement, mental health systems, were abusive. They were oppressive. They were facilitating and exacerbating harm. So when we started with nothing, it was a really radical thing to say, you all aren't doing this right, and we've got it, we're going to do it differently. And that being led by the voices of survivors, and really being guided by the experiences and insights of survivors, and recognizing what was happening in these systems. And that was intensified for people of color and for queer people. Their experiences in those systems were more traumatic because of the institutionalized racism and sexism and homophobia that were embedded in those systems. And so you know, when we're talking about some of these things, it's in a context where we're creating something that didn't exist. And throughout this 40-year history, we have been in struggle. We have been in challenge. We've had allies in each of those systems. We've had champions in each of those systems who also recognize the need for systems level change. But that's where it has been such a complicated array of factors that we're trying to address with this kind of systems level change with very few resources, and trying to, I mean, when you were talking, Annette, about, you know, we were fighting for money. It is like because we had no infrastructure, we didn't have support. There's a reason we're relying on volunteers. Why all of us were serving on the board as volunteers before we had staff, which really was powerful, but also made this kind of systems level change that we were pursuing arduous and a long journey. So I know some of the things that we're describing are things you're also still trying to address. And we're grateful for that because we know how critically important it is.
Thank you. So Tanya and Lacey, this question is for you. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the early days in regards to research or evidence-based practices, you know, or the lack thereof?
Sorry. So, I mean, you know, as I said earlier, the three of us have PhDs. And I started this work as a volunteer, and there's always been a tension in this field about volunteers versus professionals, or the increasing professionalization of this work and the way in which that reduced some of the activism and advocacy efforts that were underway. And so I think of myself as an activist academic. I think of myself as someone who has taken what I know about what needs to be done into the academy. For me, the reason I got a PhD was driven by the question of how do we better serve the needs of survivors? Working in the field and seeing that what we were doing was helpful but insufficient. And at the time, we had so little information available to us that it was gold. When we found an article that resonated and reflected what we were observing, it was profound. So I think the first sexual assault article by Burgess and Holstrom came out in 1977. And they coined it rape trauma syndrome, which was trying to capture the complexity of trauma responses, because we were having cases being dismissed and people being blamed because their presentation of trauma didn't match someone's mindset of what a traumatized person looked like. And so, you know, for us to, I mean, and from the beginning with working with Lacey, one of the things that we were always doing in this process of how do we do this better is trying to find the voices of survivors to help inform that process. And so I shared the example previously when we ended up in our doctoral program together at UT Austin. And the first publication we did was based on data we collected as practitioners at the Austin Rape Crisis Center, where we did outreach to the LGBTQ community to say, what is your perception of the Rape Crisis Center? Do you see us as a resource within your community? And they did not. They had a positive view of us, but didn't see it as a place for them. And I'm a member of that community. So when I say them, I'm in that community. But that became our first publication, was sharing with people the perceptions that they had. The second publication came from the legislation that we talked about on sexual exploitation by psychotherapists, where that was, once we were able to get that legislation passed, it was trying to assess, do people even know that that law exists? Do they understand what their obligations and opportunities are through that law? And so it was an assessment that was then used to provide information to the state for training that was needed for licensure for social workers. For me, most of my research has been focused on evaluating the effectiveness of trauma treatments, because we didn't have evidence-based trauma treatments when we were practicing. And so we used a lot of empowerment and client-centered strengths-based approaches that were helpful but insufficient for really helping people process and resolve the trauma they were experiencing. And so being able to have evaluations of prevention education efforts to see, you know, we now have a robust set of trauma treatments, and we have some really promising, strong prevention education programs that we have demonstrated through really rigorous science what works. And so it has been really exciting to see over the course of this 40 years a tiny bit of knowledge, scientifically based knowledge available to us, to a really robust set of information that's guiding this work. And in part, I mean, we're seeing this across all aspects of disciplines and across prevention and treatment. But when I go to this, the Society for Social Work and Research conference now, there used to be literally 3 or 4 of us doing gender-based violence research. Now we have one of the largest special interest groups at the conference with some of the strongest science being produced. And many of those folks, most of them in fact, began their work as volunteers and staff in domestic violence and rape crisis centers.
You know, I just will quickly add that I went to get my PhD because I wanted to be able to have some respect for the legislatures here in Texas, and not, you know, have them always listening to the, you know, the police and attorneys and everything like that. And it was the polygraph exams that kind of got me started, found out from other TASA members. Yes, it wasn't just in San Marcos, Hays County, Caldwell Center, where I used to work, where somebody was being polygraphed. It was happening to, you know, adolescents in Houston. It was happening to women of color in Dallas. And then we started finding out where is this happening, and when are they asking survivors to be polygraphed? Before they press charges, you know, before they talk to the offender. Then to mention a name that may or may not be positive, Geraldo Rivera called and wanted to know because Hinojosa had sponsored a bill to ban it. Is it just another weird thing that you Texans do, down there, polygraphing rape victims? So then because of the National Coalition, we found out, no, this is happening all over the US. Part of the rape myths, that women frequently lie about being raped. And in fact, when we talk about systems change, that is so important, not just serving survivors. We've got to stop them from falling off the cliff and ending up in that crisis river to begin with. So changing how we saw our relationships with each other, men and women, and other marginalized and oppressed populations, because we realize when we allow anybody to be marginalized because of gender, because of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, immigration status, we allow them to be victimized, and it's all the same. It's about dehumanizing one group of people, and we needed to change that. So that's what I'm saying.
Thank you. Oh, Ann, go ahead. Are you done? Okay. All right, y'all. So last question, and then I'll have a closing remark, and then we will be on our way. But so, it's just really nice to sit, I had a chance to talk to you all last night over dinner. And like I said, I could have talked to you all for hours and hours and hours. Just again, I grew up in rural Texas, and that's just something that we did. We would sit around the campfire and hear about the good old days, if you will, from the cool aunts and the elders and the elders. So, but I want to ask you one last question, if you could briefly answer each of you. And I think about now funding is, we're always thinking we need more money. There's some of the same things apply today, but before that, what kept you all in the movement? What sustained you as you did this in the early days? And we'll start with Richard, then we'll go this way.
What kept me going? These people kept me going. Writ large, we've had a lot of talk about volunteers. Every word of it's true in my experience. I was gifted, literally gifted by being brought into this movement, most improbably. And when I got in it, I immediately, for some reason, started identifying with all these women who, in a sense, just had their backs against the wall and were not going to take it anymore. There was something really mystical and magical about that. So that's what kept me in it.
Well, I know we've talked a lot about volunteers, but I'd like for all of you to understand that we people here on the stage represent thousands of people who did this work in the very early days. I mean, we would have a class of at the Austin Rape Crisis Center, we'd have a class of 40 new volunteers. And we did that, several times a year. And often we had many more people who wanted to be, they were like on a waiting list to be volunteers. And they came from all parts of the communities. They came from different professions. It was really, really a fascinating learning experience for all of us. But it's important to me again to recognize that we're here, but we represent so many more people who said, this is a problem, we need to do something about it. And I just want to honor all of those people that we represent. People used to, speaking about, men and gender issues, one of the things that people used to say to me, oh, you work in rape crisis, you must hate men. That was it was one of the things that they used to say to me. And I would respond, I have seen absolutely the worst things that men can do. But we have men volunteers, we have men staff members, and I also have learned the very best things that men can do. That was always my answer, and that's true. And it's one of the things that helped sustain me is that I admired so many women who did this work, but I also admired all of the people in the community from all various communities who were willing to join the fight. And that is what sustained me over so many years. You're never alone. You always have somebody to call. And that was just so important. And I used to say that I started in the movement for the rage, but I stayed for the love, because that's what we had for each other.
I think I stayed in the work because the job wasn't done. We have not ended rape. And I think that, you know, there's two things that I felt like really needed to happen more in the movement, and I needed to be part of that. One is more self-reflection. I think as a group, we can be a fairly self-righteous group, and, you know, as advocates, our job is to piss people off. I mean, you know, let's be honest. And there are reasons for that, but we weren't very good at self-reflection. And, you know, at least on a systemic level. And I mean, I think you can look up at all the white faces up here and tell where one of the areas that we fell short. And I'm not saying that there weren't efforts being made, but it didn't get done. And so, you know, more work needed to be done on lots of levels. And I encourage us to continue to grow and be better at doing that work and always keep the needs of survivors in the forefront. And I think the other thing is to embrace those partnerships. There's been historical friction between different groups. Part of it is because we have different roles, and I get that. But you know, through mutual respect and ethical communication, and sometimes just the fact that we're saying, grow the hell up. We've got to continue this because survivors deserve all of us to be working at this, whether we always like each other or we always agree with each other. That is irrelevant. What is relevant is that we all say we want to end sexual violence, so we need to continue to work together. When people come through our doors, and sometimes the problem is who isn't coming through our doors, right? So we need to do better at that. But one of the things that we need to realize is when people come into us, we're not asking them, what religion are you? What political party are you from? You know, what do you believe in? It's not our job to indoctrinate people. It's our job to figure out what they identify their needs to be and how do we help them with that healing process. And that's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. And that's fine to be uncomfortable. There can be diversity, can bring that kind of strength. And diversity doesn't just mean people who look different, but people who think different. And that doesn't always feel good in the moment, but we owe it to survivors to continue working on that every day.
So Annette stole some of my answer, but I will say, as I said last night, I've given a lot to this movement for 48 years. Sometimes I'm not sure why I'm still in it, because I think I'm the only one still working at a center. But I got a lot from it. I've got some close relationships. Richard and Lacey, I have stayed in constant touch with no matter where we lived or what we were doing. But my very closest friend, I met when she volunteered for the program when I ran the Rape and Suicide Crisis Center of Southeast Texas in Beaumont. And we have stayed in touch, again, no matter what country we lived in or where we were. And that feeds me because we are like-minded. We have had shared experiences. We have been in the trenches together. And I just always feel like if there's something going on, Richard and I can call each other and commiserate. And Lacey, I mean, we can go stay with each other and work out a problem. But I think there are a lot of things that we share that we don't even have to talk about because we've been through the same thing. And so while I'm still fighting the good fight, I think the fight has also nurtured me.
I think, you know, I was only, I think, 27 when I started in Rape Crisis Center, and I'm now on Medicare. So it has changed my entire life. it's where I really learned about the intersectionality of oppression. I always wanted to do something to make the world a better place. And I feel like I have, and I've taken what I've learned from this movement and from the connection with all these people as I've done work, especially in the Middle East. And it's, bringing, yes, I do understand how this is all connected. And it's just, it has sustained me. It has taught me a new way of looking at the world and how to bring everybody together. People, back when I was 27, I never would have thought that I'd be, have one of my best friends would be the rape crisis law enforcement officer in our town, but I have met so many amazing people and I'm always learning. And it's been a great opportunity to continue to create and innovate. I am going to actually retire though.
So I think I may be the youngest person on this panel at 60. I started this work in 1980, so I've been doing it for 42 years. And what was life-changing for me, I went to college to become a theater major and became a social worker through volunteering at the Regional Crisis Center and having the opportunity to be in a community that was trying to make substantial change in our society. And so there's the part of it is the profound way that it impacts your heart and soul to be a part of someone's healing and recovery, to see people reclaim their lives when they've been devastated by violence and trauma is a privilege, and it is an honor, and it is inspiring, and it is empowering. And so particularly in the early days, like the work directly working with survivors, and then also being in the community of people really working hard to do that self-reflection you're talking about, Annette, to really recognize the ways in which we have so many layers of injustice, that intersectionality perspective, bringing gender and racial equity lens to all the work that we do has stayed with me. So part of the sustainability is being a part of something larger and meaningful that is life altering, not just for the people we're working with, but for ourselves. And so, at 18, I made the decision that this is what I wanted to be my life's work. And 42 years in, I'm not done. And part of the sustainability is finding ways to do that in different ways. Like I have no need to ever be on call again or take a hotline call. Kudos to you. And I did that for over 20 years, and I'm grateful for those opportunities that I had. But I think part of it is looking at all the different kinds of ways you can contribute, and hopefully you get a sense of that. So some of that contribution was being on the TASA board. Like I wanted to, when I was doing clinical work and working on my PhD, I was on the TASA board because I wanted to be engaged in the systems level work. I wanted to be engaged in supporting something larger. And so whatever that is for you, whether you're doing direct services or prevention education or administration, each of those roles are important contributions. And this isn't a job. It is a calling. It is a mission, and it is values driven. And that is what has been life-sustaining work for me.
Thank you. Thank y'all. All right, so in closing, they're gonna put a picture, if you can put the picture up, the AV guy back there, Ted but in closing, what I wanted to say, y'all, is listening to you, being in the space and listening to all of the your experiences and the history and how we came to be. I just wanted to say that we're going to take the figurative torch as this current CEO of the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, and all of us here that are currently doing this work, currently wanting to make sure that we make Texas, safer, and that we work with all the survivors in Texas and make sure that they have what they need. What I'm learning and what I'm realizing is that TASA is not just an organization. It's not just a nonprofit. It's not just a 501c3. TASA is an intangible. It's a Texas-sized concept that represents support, connection, and survivor in every sense of that word. And so for as long as I've been at TASA and hearing you all, I know for a long time, sexual assault advocates have been kind of outside looking in, knocking on the door, wanting to come in and be a part of the conversation. And so the picture that you all see on the screen, it's very historic. It's very symbolic. So in the 86th legislative session, the Sexual Assault Survivor Task Force passed through the ledge, and it was signed by Governor Abbott. And it created, again, the Sexual Assault Survivor Task Force housed in the governor's office. And so the reason why I show this picture, there's me on the edge talking with my hands like I always do, going like this. And I'm not showing it because it's me. I'm showing this because it's an ode to what you all did in the foundational days. And what that represents is this historic piece of legislation to finally, on a statewide level, have the key players at the table, and sexual assault advocates are at the table. And not only are we at the table, but we're being heard. In that picture, you can see that everybody's kind of listening to whatever I was saying then. So I think that is a very important thing. As one great Texas governor once said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So cheers to another 40 years of existence for TASA, and congratulations and thank you all for the work that you do. And thank you for joining us today on this panel. And thank each and every one of you for all the work you've contributed to our great state, to survivors, and all the wisdom that you've imparted upon us today. So thank you all so much.